And just before we go on, just to let you know, I might have said this before when we've met, but I've got chickens in the garden. They are meant to be there; they're not wild or anything. But occasionally they will get rather noisy. And if I have to
That's
say,
fine. That's great. I love country sounds and
yeah,
something like this.
they might get noisy. And it was only recently that I was informed that actually, when one of them lays an egg, chickens will tend to celebrate that
Yes,
that
I've heard
fact.
this.
And I said, "Really? What on earth you go?" But no, and that what happened because I've been out there before, and literally, if chickens could give a round of applause to one of their colleagues, it would be that. It would be the kind of willing them on. They kind of cluck in encouragement when the egg laying is happening, and then when my chickens are called Rasputin, Lavender, and Princess Leia, named by my children. And when particularly when Rasputin comes out, literally the other two are giving the chicken a round of applause. But it can be a really loud celebration.
That's fantastic. Hi, everyone. Hope you're all well. Today, I want to drop a bombshell and talk about the F word. Yep, that's right. Feelings. And in particular, I want to talk about feelings at work. After all, we don't leave our feelings at the front door as we go off to work, do we? Or in the kitchen with our breakfast as we head to our laptop. Our emotions are part of what makes us who we are, basically. So I want to explore the role of emotions in teams and how we can foster, more often than not, hopefully, positive emotions in the workplace. With this in mind, I'm delighted to welcome my friend and colleague, Steve Hargreaves. Steve is a leadership and culture specialist and author of a really brilliant book called The Compassionate Leader's Playbook. His main professional raison d'etre is to help sustain and build more emotionally healthy, resilient, and compassionate workplaces where everyone has the opportunity to stay well and thrive. Basically, a man with a philosophy after my own heart. So I can't wait to chinwag with him about our subject.
So maybe in the workplace we can all behave like chickens more often and
Yeah,
celebrate
I've
our
actually,
wins.
actually, it's a brilliant metaphor for our subject, isn't it? About that, sort of being cognizant of one another,
Yeah,
in terms of
absolutely.
how each other's feelings. Because I think a lot of our listeners will probably have a pretty good handle on organizational culture, but the that F word, feelings,
Mm.
isn't the language of business, really, is it? And even still today in the 21st century, with loads of millennials in the workplace, etc., we're still not brilliant at talking about emotions. So when you put those two notions together, an emotional culture, what is it, Steve?
Yeah, what a great intro and a great question. And we're going to talk about the F word, that magic word feelings. And we're going to reframe that away from it being some sort of soft, nice to have thing that, when we're not so busy, we'll get round to and try and reposition feelings and emotions as being absolutely pivotal and vital to how we perform, how we work, our relationships, and our well-being. Really, well, there are some definitions around this, and I'm gonna give you my own version, but just in terms of clarity. And you mentioned organizational culture. So when we talk about corporate culture, which is often, I think, the term used, I think we're often referring to more that cognitive thinking culture. And it's been described as the shared intellectual values, the norms and the assumptions that serve as a guide for how the group behaves. It sets the tone for how we think, how we make decisions, how customer focused or innovative or team centered we are. So it's the thinking aspect of our culture. And often that's almost been the one that's been given all or most of the attention. And it's really, really important to be aware that it's only part of the whole. And it's really important, obviously, how we think and how we make decisions in organizations. But the other critical part is what we call the emotional culture. And every organization, every group, and every team has an emotional culture, whether it's known, acknowledged, or recognized. That's the other thing to bear in mind.
Or wanted?
Or wanted, absolutely. But an emotional culture exists. So that for me is the emotional experience of being part of the team or the group or the organization. And it's referred to as the affective values and norms and assumptions, which really importantly govern which emotions people have and express at work, but really importantly, which emotions they feel able to express and which emotions they feel they need to suppress in the workplace. But I suppose the short answer would be the emotional experience of being part of a team. How does it feel? And also, how are you allowed to feel?
Brilliant that you sort of described it all that way, because just as you were talking, there was so many things that are resonating for me. The first is the fact that you talked about thinking versus feeling. And I believe the mistake that in organizations very often happens is leaders, managers will kind of go, well, if I can influence the thinking, that will help people to feel whatever I want them to feel. But actually, it's the reverse.
Yeah.
Our feelings drive our thinking and our behavior, not the other way around. The other thing that as soon as you said about, talking about that F word. I'll never forget. This was years ago. I bet they still exist actually, but years ago, I can remember talking to a very senior leader, and the subject was actually how he particularly managed the performance management review, the sort of the appraisal conversations that he might have with his team members. And I don't know why, but we got into the notion of how the quality of his developmental feedback. And basically, he was pretty poor at it. And he said to me straight off, "Oh, I don't want to open the can on the feeling side of things.
Yeah.
I really don't want to go there because then I've got somebody blubbering in front of me, and I don't want to go there." So there's a whole stack of assumptions operating there, and that's why I interrupted you and said want they don't want to go there for probably a whole bunch of other reasons as well. One of the things that we have to recognize is people don't check in their feelings at the front door when they leave to come to work, if they're actually going physically to work, or perhaps at the breakfast table when they go to their laptop, to click into that Teams meeting or that Zoom call or whatever it is. So we're emotional animals, and it's just part of being.
Yeah.
So
I think
get on with it.
I think you've nailed it. And I often think about, so we're together at 10 o'clock in the morning today. I've been awake since 6. And I woke up with a whole range of feelings and emotions and thoughts, some of them quite interesting, some of them quite bizarre, some of them a bit troubling. I've already had lots of, feeling based experiences by the time we've come together today, Joe. And that's part of, being a normal, regular human being. Yet we try to come at so much life in purely rational, logical, cognitive ways. And so much of our workplaces try and do the same with us. And we wonder why that performance, engagement, well-being, team effectiveness, whatever, collaboration, collegiality, whatever you want to say, may not be as good as it needs to be. But there's a recognition that we bring our emotional selves to work. And the expression of our emotions in the workplace is not, well, that means everybody's going to go around crying and going to need lots of hugs. Well, we can't possibly have that, can we? I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counselor. And and I kind of get it on one level where that comes from, which is why a lot of the work that I do, and I've kind of labeled it emotional culture crafting, is how can we normalize emotions in the workplace so it is seen as a in an appropriate way, rather than emotions equals people losing control or getting angry or all of that. So we need a more emotionally mature approach in our workplaces, and quite understandably, we might need to help people to do that, and so we can challenge our assumptions and all the rest of it. But it really matters, and it's not about a culture where we can all just talk about our emotions and get in a better mood. That's not what it's about. But as you said, it matters because we feel things, and how we feel drives how we think and how we behave and how we make decisions.
Yeah.
And our physical state. And we don't come at life in purely logical, rational, and cognitive ways. I mean, maybe that's just me, Joe.
Do you think this is generational?
I don't think it is generational. I think there is a different level of emotional literacy, which may exist from a generational level. And of course, it relates to, so what I think what does impact generationally often is our own experience of the workplace. So, and I'm wary of getting into too many stereotypes, but for the purpose of this, I will, because I think there's credibility around it. So my father's generation, came into work, probably had a job for life. You defer to authority. The deal was, you follow the rules, you'll get promotion, you'll get an index-linked pension, you'll get a company car. Follow the hierarchy, defer to it, don't challenge, all of that stuff. So we get to a shift where I'm coming into work and it's a bit more about, well, we want to talk a little about vulnerability and about authenticity a bit more. Um, but if we ask somebody that's coming to work and the environment has been, you suppress your vulnerability, you suppress your emotions, you are punished, not rewarded for that. The workplace is where you leave your emotions at home and come into work. It's a lot to ask to suddenly say, actually, let's explore some of these things around how we can build greater connection in our relationships through expressing vulnerability. And that's a big ask, I think. And
I think it's a huge ask. But I think the fundamental question here is, how do you want your people to feel at work or in this team?
yeah.
And let's not impose that on people, but let's create it together.
Yeah, and that, of course, is a key question, and that can be answered in a very appropriate and proportionate way to work. I mean, let's look at it this way, and a couple of stories here. So I was running a workshop around emotional culture, and the chief finance officer um, was not hugely engaged. And at a break, I went to speak to him, and he said to me, "Well, I just really don't have emotions. I don't really feel a great deal." So I'm questioning the credibility of this workshop. And actually, by the end of the day, he became the biggest advocate for what we were doing. But because of course, it wasn't. He's a highly intelligent guy, and it wasn't because but it was about developing the language. So I think we have to develop the organizational language and literacy so we can get get emotional appropriately. But emotions are data. So the other story is, the performance analyst, who's questioning the validity or the need for this kind of discussion. Well, reframe that. Emotions are data. So if, I said to him, your organization is amazing at capturing data, activity data, outcome data, impact data. Every part of your supply chain. You are data rich. It's overwhelming. Thank you very much, he said. So, but the biggest gap, you have no emotions. You have no data around your emotions. So if you can reframe emotions as data, suddenly that begins to become much more interesting, because actually, if we don't know how our people want to feel and not feel to be successful, how can we build the conditions for them to be successful? If we don't know how our people are currently feeling, how can we respond appropriately? How can we leverage the power of emotions to help our people, help our customers, help our stakeholders feel the things they want to feel more often, either as an employee, either as a customer, either as a stakeholder? Because then it requires us, to your point, Joe, that if we say, well, we want our people to feel this and we don't want them to feel this, okay, then the next question is, well, so what? So what are we
Why
going to
should we
do?
bother? Yeah, no,
Because
exactly.
and I think I'm always keen on the so what questions, and I think we have to ask the so what questions until we run out. There's no more. And the so what question is, okay, this is how our people want to feel and not feel to be successful. So what are we going to do? Because then it asks questions of you at the individual level about, how do I behave? The team level, how do we collectively, and how are we accountable for helping each other feel the things they want to feel? And how at the system level does the system reinforce, empower, or undermine the desired emotional culture that we wish to create? And I tend to work in very practical examples. And I was working with a big GP practice recently, with 8 GP partners, having real problems with staff turnover, and people were just leaving. They weren't happy. There was various assumptions being made, that the receptionist is grumpy, she's difficult, she's not performing, and all the rest of it. So I went to speak to the receptionist who'd left, and she agreed to speak to me. And I said, tell me a bit about your experience. And she said, well, I think they think I've left because I was busy and couldn't cope and was stressed. That wasn't the case at all. I know full well this is a stressful environment. It's a GP practice in the community. I've been working in this area for years. That was never the reason. So, well, tell me, what was the reason? It was the lack of civility and respect. It was feeling that I wasn't seen, that I wasn't regarded as important. And I said, well, how did that show up? Well, she said, so emotionally, what was happening was I was withdrawing to protect myself, and that was then being observed as me being difficult and grumpy and withdrawn. And I didn't feel able to safely express how I was feeling and why I was showing up in that way. And I said, well, give me some examples of what was leading to that. So, okay, well, we've got all these GPs and other health professionals coming into work every day. 9 times out of 10, no one says good morning to me. 9 times out of 10, no one says good evening to me when they leave.
Mind me.
When I receive an email, because everybody's busy and stressed, it rarely has my name at the top and rarely says anything like, hey, how you doing? It's a very transactional email. It just gives me an instruction.
Task focused,
Task
yeah.
focused, no top or bottom, so the thing is, I end up feeling uncared for and unseen. And I spoke to some of the GPs, and GPs say, well, I do that, but blimey, that's only once a day. I said, but the cumulative effect of 9 out of 10 people not saying hello, not saying goodbye, sending, I don't know if I'm able to swear on your podcast, Joe.
Though not to, but
Yeah.
you can use
I'll
fruity
rephrase it to
language.
crappy emails that aren't very
That's a good one.
respectful, a lack of courtesy, a lack of civility. I said, the receptionist is receiving that 10 times a day, every day. So the cumulative impact of those things has led to that person having an emotional experience of this organization that has led her to leave, not because she's grumpy and difficult and not performing,
Yeah.
and not because she's stressed and can't cope. And that was a fairly long story, but I think for me, in a very practical way, begins to reposition emotional culture. And I said to the GPs, you have to decide what type of an emotional culture you want to craft in this GP practice.
Yeah,
This
I
is
totally agree. I think it's a great story, and you've raised lots and lots of issues for me. I often find that this subject that we're discussing now actually creates the glue that creates more cohesive teams and enables greater psychological safety and greater feeling of connectedness, if that's a word for team working. And you've raised the other point, which is about literacy and having the language and knowing even how to approach it. What would be the mechanism? How do you go about it? Because, and I think the reason why this is important is because unless you're a complete psychopath or you've got some other psychological disorder of one type or another, and you have no sensitivity whatsoever, you can pick up in an average day if your colleague is in a good mood or in a bad mood, because there's just something in the air, isn't there? And so you notice it. But we, for whatever reason, probably a whole bunch of reasons, as individuals, we don't know how to manage it. We don't have
yeah,
the language, we don't have the ways that we might engage with somebody to deal with that. If the team is able to has the language, has the means by which they can nurture and support one another, it takes the monkey off the team leader, and it's generated, and something is done about it through the team. So it's almost, I think, after a while, what I've seen is it's self-perpetuating. The team will do this for themselves,
yeah,
rather than some consultant like you or me coming in and trying to fix it for them.
yeah. Well, this has to be a co-creation process, and maybe let's talk about that. But a couple of things you said there, of a couple of things I feel it's important to say, is this isn't kind of woo-woo stuff. There is massive research
Oh
around
yeah, definitely, yeah.
emotional culture, and Harvard have been undertaking research, and Wharton, University of Pennsylvania, for years around
Yeah,
this. And the clear benefits. The research has found that emotional culture influences employee satisfaction, burnout, teamwork, and really importantly, even the hard measures such as financial performance and absenteeism.
yeah,
Um, and lots of empirical studies show the significant impact of emotions on how people perform on their tasks, how engaged they are, how creative they are, and how committed they are to the organization. This is also around loyalty and how they make decisions. And positive, feeling the more pleasant emotions that we want to feel, or feeling that we have a functional emotional workplace where different emotional dynamics are given room, are consistently associated with better performance quality and customer service. So there are really hard measures. And on the flip side, feeling the more unpleasant emotions more often, such as group anger or sadness or fear, lead to negative outcomes, including poor performance and
Anxiety,
productivity.
anxiety. I
Yeah,
bet since lockdown, I think that's been, and in this whole realm of well-being, mental well-being as well. Um, Notions of anxiety have really come up to the fore.
yeah. This isn't a consultant fix, although what we can offer is context and a way forward, but it requires choice and a sense of intention. But if we just keep looking at it really practically, how would you feel if you were feeling alienated, afraid, and controlled at work, but could not express that safely? How would you feel if your experience of work was confusing, that you felt unwelcome and uncertain? How would that impact on your performance, engagement, and well-being? And how about feeling encouraged, supported, and connected? How would that enhance your experience of work, your performance, etc.? So these are all, part of the emotional experience at work. And what emotions provide us with is information about what is and what is not working. Because, for example, when people feel lonely, and you can feel lonely in a team, you can feel lonely in a big busy workplace. When we feel lonely, we tend to pull away from relationships, which compounds our loneliness. So when we're doing work with hybrid and virtual teams, if people are feeling alone or lonely, um, it's great if we can reach out and build connection, but quite often we go the other way. Once we add a virtual or a hybrid team in, you can end up with an awful lot of people pulling away from relationships and then being seen or labeled as being difficult, withdrawn, grumpy, evasive, defensive. And of course, those might be presenting. That might be my experience of you, for example, Joe. But I have to go underneath that, because my my own experience is, we individualize poor performance way too much on the individual without bearing in mind that I think the vast majority of when we label people as underperformance is a reflection on the conditions within which they're working. And I think we might understand that or know that, and it's not to excuse poor motivation, all the rest of it, and we need to have that tough conversation. But the more we individualize poor performance purely on the individual, it's a get out of jail free card for the conditions within which they work.
Oh, I totally agree with that. And just building on that point that you made about the empirical evidence of greater positive emotions in the workplace. I think that there needs to be a lot more conversations with very senior decision makers, particularly who are focused on operational results, KPIs, that kind of thing, sales targets, etc., and get them to get a conversation going more about this whole subject of productivity. I mean, the UK's got a real, and has for ages had an issue around productivity, just as a business metric, if you like. And what's, I think, really interesting is our angle of attack on this whole notion of productivity has, in general terms, obviously not exclusively, but in general terms, I think our focus has been either on resources, systems, procedures, and fixing the mechanics. I think we're in a brilliant moment where we can ask more of that fundamental question, which is, and maybe replace a word, what feelings does the productivity of this team depend on?
Yeah.
And replace the success of this team. I like using the success of this team. I think it's a lovely way of exploring the idea, and you get lots of richness. I think that's a really great hook for anybody who, maybe HRDs or other managers, learning development people, who are realizing that actually, if if you're getting into conversations about the effectiveness of a team or the effectiveness of an organization overall, let's have conversations about what does success depend on emotionally.
And that's what I mean. This is important. It's data, but it's data that's really powerful and can be really powerfully leveraged for organizations. And I think the other important thing to say, and you've touched on this, is that, look, reality is we also need to feel the less pleasant emotions from time to time.
Well, they're going to happen whether we like it or not. I think things, life happens, doesn't it?
It's really important to recognize that feeling uncomfortable, feeling anxious, feeling confused and overwhelmed can serve really useful purposes if we can identify those feelings, if we can acknowledge them and understand what those feelings are teaching us and respond to them positively and constructively. We can kind of walk alongside those emotions. However, and we can build resilience through that. However, if we were to feel those things, most of the time or all of the time, that's when it becomes problematic. In the same way that if we only ever feel the pleasant emotions, we may lack motivation to learn and grow. But let's make no bones about it. It takes individual and collective effort. It will require individual and collective accountability. It will require unlearning old habits and learning new habits. But what I would say is, having been involved in this work for over 5 years now, the opportunities are huge. Whether I've worked with a group of male engineers that everybody said, well, they'll never talk about their emotions. And I can tell you, they've been some of the most amazing workshops I've ran. If we give people the tools, the permissions, create an environment of safety, we can take really powerful steps. And the opportunities and benefits that brings are huge.
Steve, as I was expecting, I could talk to you for hours around this and other things. I entered the conversation with you today with feelings of great excitement and anxiousness that I didn't cock up the whole thing. And I'm leaving with inspiration and feelings of knackeredness as well.
Yes.
So I'm going to go and have a little lie down and maybe a cup of tea as well and a biscuit. But thanks ever so much for your time. It's been really terrific to talk to you and maybe catch up with you again very soon.
Yeah, pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation. Thanks, Joe.
Take care of yourself. Bye for now.
Bye.
That's been a terrific chat, but I really do think I'm going to have to lie down in a dark room and mull it all over again. In the meantime, you can tap below to get the links and show notes. And if you enjoyed what you heard and you want to hear more, why not follow or subscribe to the show, share the podcast, or tell your friends about Gobbo. But most importantly, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me, Joe Espana, on LinkedIn or get in touch via the website. I'd love to keep the conversation going. Let me have your thoughts, questions, or ideas for topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes.